I spent the first 6 years of my life deaf. I had a eustachian tube disorder that resulted in significant conductive hearing loss in both ears. Normally, this type of hearing loss can be addressed relatively successful medically with as early as 1 year old. But in my situation, that was not the case. My deafness was not addressed or medically treated until I enrolled into school, at which point my apparent deafness prompted referrals to appropriate specialists. I had surgery pretty much immediately afterwards. The results of my first surgery were partially successful. My right ear, for all intents and purposes, was fixed. My doctors later informed me that if the first surgery hadn't worked, I would have had to go to a school for the deaf, because I was already so behind on language, and I wasn't exposed to any language. I hadn't been exposed to a language, either formally signed or spoken, that I was so behind that I couldn't afford any further delay. Now, some of you might be itching to ask if I remember what it was like to first hear, but sadly the truth is that I don't. Some research says that language is actually a critical part to forming memories. And so I have no more than a handful of memories from when I was little, but I do have a few. I have a memory of me sitting less than an inch from the TV, longing for this faint something I was feeling. I also remember going into and coming out of and waking up from my first surgery. I remember my doctor, my ENT doctor, sitting in a swivel chair to my left as I laid in the stretcher in the operating room. I remember the smell of the cherry flavor that they put on the breathing mask as I fell asleep. I remember my head feeling heavy from anesthesia, waking up afterwards. And I remember the fluorescent lights peeking through the boringly beige plastic machines to my right. But for the memories after my first surgery, the memories of elementary school, well, they're mostly of struggle and panic. Struggling to learn something obviously so fundamental that everybody knew but me. I remember being made fun of because I couldn't correctly pronounce my best friend's name that I was constantly calling out. I remember the perpetual feeling of being wrong in my daily speech-language therapy lessons with word guessing. I remember the confusion of conversations because I couldn't understand someone if they didn't sit close to me or on my good side. I remember the annoyance of my friends because they would have to endlessly repeat themselves because I couldn't make out what they were saying in the noisy world of school hallways and cafeterias. And I remember being told I was bad at singing more times than I can count. I can still feel the pressure cooker sensation of being surrounded by hearing people that had a huge head start on things like reading and speaking. I spent the next 11 years of my life essentially half deaf. I got accustomed to the world asymmetrically, and I had a strong dominant side that I relied on for everything. I used it to make sense of my surroundings and my world and to learn this English language. I also used it to learn music and eventually foreign languages when they became a requirement in my school district. I would have 3 more repeat surgeries over the course of the next 11 years, approximately every 3 years on my left ear, with the occasional tonsillectomy and adenoidectomy to see if it would help my chances. But during this time, I was very much performing below par. I was reading at a first grader level in the 5th grade, and I vividly remember this because they would color code the books and separate them into different bins based on reading level. It was so embarrassing to be struggling through a 10-page children's book while my friends were flipping through the Goosebumps series or even the first Harry Potter book. It was so embarrassing, in fact, I would pretend to read higher reading levels during silent reading in class, often timing my page turning and working on my reading face, learning from my classmates. So when it came time for current events, I would beg my best friend and neighbor at the time if I could have an article out of his family's newspaper, and he would say to me, if you can read the headline, you can have it, which seems fair. And so I would first go for things I thought might be low-hanging fruit, things I might have seen on TV and I could match with a picture in the paper. But they didn't print paper or newspaper at my reading level. And so often I would end up crying in tears, struggling through the entire paper without success. Jimmy, or as I called him, Timmy, enforced a tough love kind of approach. Now, in elementary school, by the end of elementary school, I was starting to get a little bit better. But it's really fascinating, the psychology behind assumed roles. I've always found it interesting how early we can learn them. We all know, even in elementary school, who is the class clown, the teacher's pet, the smart ones, and I, at least in the beginning, fulfilled the role of the dumb one. Very little was demanded of me, and there was sort of a status quo of she can't hear too well allowance that I firmly believe bumped me from one grade to another. That was until Mrs. Rosenberg. She didn't accept excuses, and she demanded that I meet her expectations, which she set exceedingly high. She expected me to try, and she reminded me that everything was a choice, that everything I did was a choice, and in order to move on and to move past her, I would have to try, and so I did. And so it took a long time before I started to feel comfortable academically or in school or even picking up a book. To be honest, still today, I have some residual dread of taking a book off the shelf. I often think to myself, oh my God, there's so many words in here. I probably don't know many of them. I'll have to learn them, but I won't know how to pronounce them. How long is this going to take me? But it all started there with Timmy sending me back home across the street without an article in my hand because I had failed to read every headline in the newspaper, and that love of a stubborn Jewish woman that wouldn't budge in the negotiation that was my future. They would set into place the mental habits that would lead me to Brown. Now, nothing changed overnight, nor within a few years. Middle school was a real challenge. But I was trying, and trying was having positive results, and so I was heading in the right direction. I naturally did better with things like numbers and math. I found the predictability refreshing and much less torturous than English. And middle school was also when I was introduced to Spanish, a subject that I've always liked, and something that I have historically not struggled with. I found the predictability of sound refreshing. I also loved the phonetic nature of the language. I loved that at times it was much easier than English. It was also in middle school during our last year that we were allowed to stop taking band, which was something that was required since we were in 4th grade. And even though I was absolutely horrendous at band, I had no intention of stopping. And this was not because I loved how band sounded, but I loved how it felt. I loved that if we played loud enough and in unison, and the drums had a big part, I could feel it in my body. And so when I entered high school, I took all the required classes, but I continued Spanish and band long after I was required to take them. So when it came to Spanish, when I went into high school, it was through my love of world history and also the existence of Microsoft Encarta CD-ROM that I learned that I loved other foreign languages too, and that at night I could easily teach myself the beginnings of other languages, like numbers and greetings, and I found this pretty easily. From there, my love of languages has grown. I now am fluent in Spanish, I am proficient in several other languages, and have successfully dabbled in a dozen more. Eventually, I would realize that probably learning English in a non-native way probably helped me. By the end of high school, nobody believed or even thought that I had a hearing problem. Each day and each quarter, I was coming into my own academically, artistically, and athletically. But I was still pretty much half-deaf. So then it came time, after about approximately 2 years after my 4th surgery, I was about 18 years old, to test if the tube that they put in my ear worked, that if my eardrum could handle life and the sound of the world on its own without the pressure equalizing effect that the tube afforded my ear. So when they took the PE tube out in the office, there was this pop, and then I was in a vacuum. I felt like I had been placed in a portable glass cave where the air was different. My mom wanted me to say something, and I would try, but as soon as I would try to push out a sound, the vibrations would resonate through my head at full volume, and I couldn't bear push out a word. My doctor asked me and chimed in if it sounded too loud for me to talk, and I nodded and responded with a mild but affirmative, mm-hmm. To the specialist that had been working on me since I was a child, this was a celebratory moment. And there were some positive aspects to having hearing in my left ear. It was the first time that I could hear the difference in notes in band. I had learned to play musical instruments by memorizing hand positions and finger locations. But it wasn't until I had bilateral stereo hearing that I could tell I had played the wrong note simply by its incompatibility with the person next to me. I had been playing an instrument for almost 8 years and had never experienced that. But largely for me, my transition into full hearing was rather painful. Everything in the world was just too noisy, and everything just sounded too loud to me. When people would talk to me, their voices would naturally make their way through intonation and pitches, and it would be painful and irritating, and I would have to cover my ear, and I would have to constantly be on guard for abrasive sounds that, for the most part, are not abrasive to anyone else. I also had to get used to my surroundings. Like if I went for a jog, and I wouldn't be able to tell which direction a car was coming from because it sounded as if it was coming from every direction. I also had a hard time sleeping at night because I had always slept on my right side, and this had created a silent bubble. But I couldn't recreate that anymore. My bubble was burst, and it was polluted with noise, and I could no longer step outside of the noisy world simply by lying on my right side. So for me, I wouldn't necessarily say that I was or am happier with full hearing. In fact, I often appreciate the other sensations of life a bit more. Like with music, I like the way it looks and feels. I like the way when you pluck a guitar string, it vibrates to a stop. And I like the way that wooden floorboards feel when they carry sound. By the time I got to college, nobody knew better. Nobody knew the deaf or dumb girl. But my relationship with my deafness and my relationship with just having gotten my full hearing was not in a distant past. It was very much still a part of me and still is. I was fortunate that at Ithaca College, my path between my classroom and my dorm room led me through the phenomenal music school. I would often go in and sit alongside or find a spot alongside of the stage during rehearsals and be as private and tucked away as possible and just lay on the floor, letting the music soak into my body. I loved the way that felt. Today, my deaf beginnings are almost undetectable. That is, unless you play apples to apples with me, and I read the card and name Michelle Pfeiffer as Michael Pfeiffer, or if we're watching TV and I can't go more than 2 minutes without begging for subtitles. I will also have ringing in my ears, known as tinnitus. I will always have that. And I will always struggle to read or to know what you're saying or hear you or understand you if I can't see your face or read your lips. I only learned this after spending years working in the operating room as an adult. And in this setting, people often say to me, "Why are you standing so close to me?" Often, I'd be leaning in with my good ear. Now, my relationship with deafness has sort of a bittersweet story. But I've learned to appreciate how these beginnings and breaking certain barriers of adversity have positively shaped me today. I want to end on a note where I stress that my life did not improve just because I gained hearing. My life improved because I was given access to a language. I was at the mercy of a medical community and a culture that wanted to fix me. In my particular situation, my condition was, for the most part, fixable. But had the first surgery not worked, and I wasn't able to gain hearing and learn a spoken language, I would have learned sign language, or ASL. And I would have had an equal opportunity to engage and experience a full life. In my particular situation, my deafness did not lead to a relationship with the deaf community. And that was because immediately after diagnosis, I was treated surgically and treated as a hearing person. This was probably the biggest disservice to me as a patient. My deafness was never acknowledged, and I had a very hard time kind of making my way through the world in which I was treated as a hearing person and never taught techniques about volume control by knowing the vibrations in my neck, or even just acknowledging that I would see the world differently. So, as someone who has gone through the spectrum of hearing abilities, I want to stress that even as a hearing person and an adult today, as we age, many of us will lose our hearing. My deaf beginnings and my attention to an attempt to engage with the ASL community and the deaf community now will serve me well in that capacity. And I want to encourage all of you to kind of challenge the hearing-centric tendencies in our culture and to foster participation and involvement and inclusivity of people with different abilities, not just with a hearing loss, but also with diverse abilities and disabilities that affect our sensations, mental health, and also mobility. Thank you.